Hello, this presentation is going to be about the University of Maine's 2021 Cooperative Extension Pastured Turkey Study. My name is Madison Philbrick. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maine, and my advisor is Livestock Specialist Dr. Knight. So I was the primary investigator on the study. I just finished my animal science bachelor's at the University of Maine, and now I'm a master's student. Dr. Knight is the state livestock specialist. He has his Ph.D. in animal science, and he works with University of Maine Cooperative Extension. So the objectives of this study were to raise broad-breasted turkeys on pasture using a non-traditional housing structure to test its effectiveness in providing the turkeys with adequate shelter requirements to grow overall healthy birds, to gather some growth rate data for broad-breasted turkeys on pasture, and to gather relevant feed intake and water intake for pasture-raised turkeys, and to evaluate the preferred perch height for pasture-raised turkeys. Just a little bit of background. So at the University of Maine, we've done a couple of previous studies on broiler research done by Dr. Knight. These are done using chicken tractor housing systems. We used the Joe Salatin model and built them out of wood. So the reason that this is relevant and these pasture studies are relevant is there are a lot of small homesteads and small-scale producers in Maine. So this overall study, the reason that we came up with what we were going to do was because of the rising costs in lumber and supplies from COVID-19. So we thought outside of the box and we came up with a new housing system to use for pasture-raised turkeys to try to help bring down that cost and show that this would be an effective model. Another thing to consider is traditional poultry tractors are not actually large enough for turkeys. If you're going to raise more than 5 turkeys, honestly, just to have the correct footage for them. There are not a lot of previous studies already done on pasture-raised turkeys. There was one done by Penn State, and that basically set some growth rates and gain data, but it wasn't evaluating any type of different housing structures. These are just examples of what a chicken tractor looks like if you're unfamiliar, especially with the Joe Salatin. So these were just made out of wood and chicken wire with tarps over the tops. So the definition of a pasture-raised poultry set by the Agricultural Marketing Resource Center is that pastured or free-range poultry refers to poultry production system that is characterized by chickens, turkeys, or ducks being raised primarily on pasture. The birds supplement their grain feed by foraging for up to 20% of their intake and are often moved regularly to fresh pasture. So this is the traditional broiler method that you see where the tractor is moved daily to allow new forage to be available for the chicken. So the hypothesis for this study was to build a housing structure from commercially available livestock gates and cattle panels, and that it can make a functional turkey housing system for raising small batches of turkeys on pasture. So this is the housing system that we used. This was an idea conceptualized by Dr. Knight. So basically what we did was we took all of these cattle panels, and as you can see in these pictures, the cattle panels were, or the livestock gates were put together into these formations with the cattle panels stretched across the tops. We then used hose clamps to secure those cattle panels and were able to give the structure a little bit more stability by driving T-posts in. We then built the perches for the structure. There were 9 perches in total. This allowed us to house up to 80 birds. And at the beginning of this study, we also had the feed and water inside of the original housing structure. That became not a feasible setup to effectively raise these birds, so then we created an additional feed and water housing system that was less gates but the same concept of the panels with the hose clamps. One advantage that we found to this system is Dr. Knight was actually able to put this together on his own for the original housing system. It was very easy, and I mean, you could do it by yourself. It's definitely easier with two people, but it can be done as a one-person housing system. So the materials that would be needed to replicate these kinds of housing systems is we used 4 10-foot gates, one 10-foot sheep gate, 6 16-foot gates, 6 16-foot cattle panels, 18 2x4s, the 2 required tarps, and then we used zip ties and cable clamps. For the gates, in the original picture, with the tarp off, you can see that there's actually only 4 of the 16-foot gates being used. We ended up adding in an additional gate to the middle, and I'll explain later why that change had to be made. So this whole docu-series was documented by me through some short videos. This is an example of one of those videos that was about the housing system.
So due to the feed and water and needing more room for the perches, we're actually going to be building a new rookery that's going to be just for food and water. I won't have any perches in it, and we're actually going to be doing that today. Instead of 5 gates, it will only consist of 4, so a back gate and 2 side gates, and then a front gate. But it will also still have the cattle panel wire over the top and the tarps. I'm hoping this will help with the algae problem that I'm seeing, to get those waters back under cover, because we had to actually move them under this water trailer for about a week now because we didn't have enough space in the rookery anymore. The birds were just defecating on top of all the waters, and it was a constant daily struggle to get them fixed. So, you can see turkeys are growing pretty good too. We weighed them last Wednesday, and the group average was 4 pounds, so pretty good. Cattle panel wire across the top, just like the last one. And then we're going to tarp this in, and then we're going to put the feed and water in here so that the waters are no longer under the water trailer, and we have more room to spread out the feeders.
So as you can see in this video, it was fairly easy to put the structure together. Overall, it took us maybe less than 20 minutes, 25 minutes. There were several of us working when we put this structure together, so this one was a little bit easier to put together than the large one would be. But definitely a short, easy little trip. Oops. So when the turkeys arrived for the study, they were between 3.5 and 4.5 weeks old on arrival. This was just due to availability at the time. So then what we were tracking throughout the study was the feed intake, their water intake, their biweekly, they were biweekly weighed, and then they were only weighed as one large group for the first couple of weeks, and then as we were able to identify between toms and hens, they were split, but they were not able to be split before this. So it was a running group average until we were able to identify the difference between the various turkeys. Chores were fairly straightforward. It was checking all of the feeders and waterers, filling as needed. Typically, we were filling feeders every other day, and waterers depended on what the weather was going. We moved once we had a feeding structure separate from the housing structure. The feeding structure was moved about every 10 days. And that was a little bit based off of the weather that we were having too, for what kind of conditions we were seeing. And the housing structure only had to be moved twice after the feeders were moved out of it. It stayed fairly clean after that point, and it was just used mainly for roosting for the turkeys, so we saw a lot better cleanliness there. Another huge part of this was just documenting everything that we were doing through these short videos that you saw an example of already. So this is another video about just feeding chores. I thought this video was kind of cool just because it shows a little bit of time lapse and you get to see some of the turkey personality. At this point, we had just gotten a huge rainstorm the night before when I took this time lapse, so that was why that housing structure was a little bit more dirty than I would have liked to see. We actually ended up moving it as soon as the ground permitted, which was as soon as it was dry enough to get a piece of equipment in there. The whole structure can be moved fairly easily by a truck or a tractor, which is fairly convenient in that matter. This graph shows the average weight gain for the turkeys versus the pounds of feed that they consumed over the number of days. So as the average pounds per bird increased, here they were still small. You can see it doesn't really follow this linear line, but overall their intake and growth was fairly linear. The R-squared value is 0.99, so this was a significant value. If you're unfamiliar with statistics, anything over a 0.8 could be considered significantly. Could be considered significant. Basically, the closer you get to the 1, the more significant consideration should be taken. This showed water consumption, and again, this was days on pasture versus their average liters of water consumed. You can see again it comes off of this linear line. These days were a heat spell that we got, so like the water consumption went up over those few days from what it had been, but overall it was fairly steady water. So the significance of the study, I mean, with research there's always learning, so this was a first run trial of the structure, but the structure did show that it does work. I wouldn't put more than 80 turkeys in that one housing structure just because as they got bigger, perch room would have been a limitation. and there wasn't really any room to add any more perches. So that's something you would want to consider. You would want more housing structures for more birds. Perch height was a little bit interesting. This was an observational intake, so as the turkeys grew, we'd increase the perches. If they stopped using the perches, we would reduce the height, and it was kind of a learning curve. For the most part, they were in a staggered step, so the lowest perch was 3 feet, 4.5, and then 5.5 feet. So that was at the end of the study, and at the beginning it was lower, so it was 2 feet, 4 feet, and 5 feet. And those were the only heights that we saw that the turkeys would use. And as they grew bigger, they still needed the smaller perch to help them get up onto the other perches. But they were not utilizing them for roosting anymore. They were just using them as stepping stones to get up to those higher perches. But if you took away that lower level, then they were not able to use their higher perches. They couldn't get up to them. Feed intake that we saw is a really good indicator for just some breed standard for raising them on pasture to help with some data there. So their feed conversion rate was 3.64 overall. This is fairly good for a pasture-raised bird, especially a turkey. So, I mean, it was nice to see that these turkeys grew well, got up to good weights, and their final weights were, the toms had an average of 24 pounds, and the females were 19.2, so that was nice to see, nice big turkeys. But basically this just shows that small-scale producers could fairly easily build this structure and have low maintenance and raise a bunch of pasture turkeys. A couple of issues that we ran into on the study were out at the University Winter Center. There was some vandalism one weekend, which because of the vandalism, the turkeys were looking for other roosting spots. So that exposed them to predators, and we did have a predator issue overnight, one of the nights, and lost some birds. The wind actually didn't end up being an issue for the structure. The structure held up very well in the wind. I have a whole video documenting the structure in some high intensity winds. So this held up into 45-mile-per-hour winds, and the structure held its integrity, which was really nice to see. We weren't sure how if it would hold up. So that was good. And then we had some issues with the fencing and keeping the turkeys into the field. We didn't buy poultry netting, so if we were to do this study again, the poultry netting would probably reduce most of that problem. We used electronet, just cheap electronet, and it couldn't keep the turkeys in. They were able to walk right through it. This video shows a little bit about the fencing problem. So here we are 2 weeks into the turkey project, and the turkeys are getting really big. I managed to keep them in their pastured area for all of 3 days, and we're back to jumping the fences, but they're getting pretty big. So again, with research, there's always learning. So we tried several different fence configurations. We did end up coming up at the end of the study with one that worked. So we were able to get the turkeys to stay in the field. But it was definitely a learning curve. So here we are 2 weeks into the turkey. So this video shows the damage that had
So
happened.
it's been a pretty unfortunate weekend out here at the turkey project. We had somebody come in, some vandals come in on Saturday, and they actually knocked over our turkey house. And the turkeys didn't really recover from that. Took some work to get it back up, and we actually lost some birds that night to a predator. And then yes, Sunday night was all good out here. No tragedies or anything. The turkeys are starting to return to normal. And then yesterday, we got a ton of rain. And our house, due to already having structural damage, didn't fare so well. This actually bent the T-post in the ground, so that's interesting. But most of this roof, this was already done from the structure being collapsed on itself, and that just took away the structure's integrity, so it was not able to withstand the winds. As far as our feeding house structure, did a little bit better. It's bent slightly on the fronts of the walls, again from the rain. This gate maybe wasn't quite tight enough to give the support it needed. I'm sure we'll put T-posts in today, but this is going to require a few more hose clamps to fix. It's a pretty good storm.
Yeah, so in conclusion, this housing and feed system works to safely house the turkeys. If we hadn't had vandalism, I don't think we would have had the issues that we did with the predators. Again, that would be situational too, like every area is predisposed to predators. And having high voltage fencing does help with that. Again, our feed conversion rate was 3.42 pounds on pasture, so it was fairly good for their growth rate and everything. We ended up with nice fat turkeys, and yeah. And yeah, basically the broad-breasted turkeys can be grown to an average of 22 pounds when you take the two averages of the toms and the hens. Toms are always going to be bigger than hens. So the importance of this study was that it showed that this is an affordable housing system to build. I don't have all the cost comparison analysis to do between if we had built wood versus this system yet, but we were able to build these housing structures for it was around $1,200 all said and done, which at the time lumber was significantly higher cost to build something of this size. This also can be modified pretty easily to fit the needs of the producer. You could add more gates to make the structure longer. I wouldn't go much bigger if you plan on moving it, just because it's a little bit hard to slide through the field. Those gates snag a little bit, so I would probably, if I was going to do more birds, I'd build multiple housing systems. But you can modify it however you need to for your own turkeys. The study also, gave some best practice raising guidelines. I'm not going to say everything we did was perfect because it was far from perfect, but this definitely helped give some guidelines for a small scale producer looking to get into turkeys. And it also provided, some pasture growth data that we didn't necessarily have on the broad-breasted turkeys. So what's next? We definitely need to do more research. I'd love to do another trial again with some more breeds, fixing our fencing issues, and really just honing down and making this structure the best possible structure it could be. There was a lot of learning already done in this study, but I would love to make some modifications and potentially improve. Yeah. So if you have any questions, you can contact Dr. Colt Knight. That's his email address, or myself. The phone number listed is for Dr. Knight's grazing behavior lab if you'd like to get in touch with him. And I would like to thank you all for listening to my presentation.